Hello, welcome to this conversation on the economics of a border poll, which is taking place as part of this year's Féile on Newry Belfarista. My name is Conor Patterson. It is a great privilege to be contributing to the free, open and challenging debates for which the Féile has become world famous. I lead an enterprise agency team which has made a significant contribution to the transformation of the Newry, South Armagh and South Down areas since the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. That transformation was possible because of the progressive dissolving of barriers to trade and political and social collaboration which followed the agreement. All of that was placed at risk by Brexit. The outworking of the impact of Brexit has radically changed the nature of economic and political interaction between Britain and this island. Like the impact of the pandemic, changes which might before the event have been expected to happen over 10 or 20 years after Brexit have been compressed by a chain reaction of events into a much shorter time frame. As Vladimir Lenin famously said, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. We are living through such weeks now. Discussions about what a new post-partition Ireland would be like, how it might come about and when, happening across the land, in communities with different cultural and political histories, north, south, east, west, urban, rural, working class, middle class. And the question that they all come to is, when will there be a border poll? Because it seems to be widely accepted that it will be a case of when, not if. So let me introduce Professor Adele Bergin and Professor Seamus McGuinness, two expert economists whose insights on issues of fundamental importance to the future well-being of everyone living on the island of Ireland must be heard and taken seriously by decision makers in Dublin, Belfast and London. Adele Bergin is an associate research professor at the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, and Seamus McGuinness is a research professor also at the Institute. They are, in addition, both adjunct professors in the Department of Economics at Trinity College Dublin and research fellows at the Institute for Labour Economics, IZA, in Bonn, Germany. They have been researching north-south differences in life quality across a range of dimensions and assessing questions of economic efficiency and public service provision, which will need further large-scale government-led research well in advance of any future border poll. Their work on these topics has already been published in peer-reviewed journals such as the Cambridge Journal of Economics and Irish Studies in International Affairs. If we have learned anything from David Cameron's ill-planned Brexit referendum, it is that citizens who are being asked to make an historic decision that will affect their lives and those of generations yet to be born, they deserve to have credible evidence laid before them, rather than slogans and battle buses. Expertise has in the last year regained its rightful value in shaping policy. So Seamus and Adele, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand over to you now to take us through some of the key findings from your expert research.
Thanks, Conor. It's really nice to have the opportunity to talk to you today. So we'll kick off with the presentation discussing some of our research in this area. Okay, so just for context, the increased prominence of the border poll debate has been driven by the result of the Brexit referendum. Demographic change is also a factor. But there's considerable uncertainty regarding when and how any border poll may be triggered. Disruptions from Brexit may lead to this occurring sooner rather than later. Possible constitutional change is a very complex and a very contentious issue. And there's a real need for an evidence-based approach to any debate. Information must be factual and based on comparable indicators. And as Conor has already alluded to, the mistakes of the Brexit referendum must be avoided. So the research that Seamus and I have done provides some initial indications of the breadth of detail and analysis that's required for any debate to proceed in a meaningful manner. I think we don't have all the answers. In some ways, we ask more questions than we answer. But given that we can't say when a border poll may arise, it's really important that we start to prepare for it now. So what are some of the key themes that are relevant for the debate? Firstly, we need to understand how income levels compare in Northern Ireland relative to GB and the Republic. In our work, we find that Northern Ireland performs relatively poorly compared to GB and the South, and this is due to lower productivity levels. So the next question is around what might explain relatively lower productivity in the North. And we think this is likely to be driven by a number of factors, including lower educational attainment, factors related to industrial composition, lower levels of export orientation, and lower intensity and poor quality FDI. And then the next key themes are around how the health systems, North and South, compare, the costs of unification, and finally, the kind of information and research that is needed for an informed debate. So before getting into all of these themes, I just want to show one graph, which I think provides a good measure of overall differences in general welfare and in living standards across countries. So it's life expectancy at birth for Ireland, the UK, and Northern Ireland. And if you looked at the left-hand side of the graph first, we can see that life expectancy in Ireland was below that in the UK and the North between 2000 and about 2005, with the rates in the North and the UK broadly mirroring each other. Then Irish rates converged on UK rates in the middle of the 2000s, while a gap opened up between Northern Ireland and the UK rates. And then more recently, there's been continued improvement in the Irish rates, while the rate of improvement in the UK and in the North has kind of tailed off. So by 2017, life expectancy at birth in Northern Ireland was around 0.7 years below the UK average, and around 1.6 years below that in the Republic. And these data are from Eurostat. So in terms of differences in income levels, how is the Northern economy been performing in comparative terms? In terms of GDP per capita, the North consistently ranks amongst the poorest regions relative to GB, and the gap between the gap relative to the wealthier regions has tended to be widening over time. So in one of our papers, we look at this data over 2000 to 2014, and over that time period, the North ranked the 10th poorest out of 12 regions in the UK, ahead of the Northeast and Wales. That's relative to GB, relative to Ireland, and for Ireland, obviously, we use GNI star per capita, because we want to remove the FDI distortions, which can overinflate economic activity in Ireland. So using the gap in GNI star in per capita terms, the gap is around 50%. So overall, this points to lower productivity in the North relative to Ireland and to GB. So again, on income levels, a reliable measure that can be used to assess living standards is real household disposable, so that's after tax income, adjusted for price differences between the regions. And so according to OECD data, disposable income was around $4,600 higher in the South than in Northern Ireland in 2017. So this is a gap of around 12%. And again, it's accounting for differences in prices between both areas. But I suppose this doesn't tell us anything about how income is distributed across the population in both areas, and probably more importantly, the risk of poverty. So households are considered to be at risk of poverty when their income is less than a particular threshold. So setting the threshold at 60% of median income, OECD data shows that the proportion of households at risk of poverty was around 23.8% in Northern Ireland compared to 15.9% in the Republic. So one of the key factors that is likely driving Northern Ireland's relatively lower productivity is education and human capital development. And one of the arguments we make is that education enrolment is a good metric for the kind of opportunities for life progression for individuals. So this table shows education enrolment rates across the life cycle. The data is for 2018 and it comes from the OECD. So the table shows that across all ages, education enrolment rates are lower in the North compared to the Republic. So for example, the rate of young people, those aged 15 to 19, enrolled in post-compulsory education is 93% in the South compared to 74% in the North. Rates of enrolment amongst 20 to 29-year-olds in the South are almost double that of Northern Ireland, indicating higher levels of participation in third level education. Another indicator of life opportunity at the bottom of the table is the rate of early school leaving. And early school leaving is measured as the proportion of individuals aged 18 to 24 who have finished no more than a lower secondary education and are not involved in further education or training. And again, according to OECD data, the rate of early school leaving in the North is almost twice that of the Republic. So in 2018, 9.4% of young people aged 18 to 24 were classified as early school leavers in the North, compared to just 5% in the Republic. So Seamus is going to talk through the rest of this.
So thanks, Adele. So other factors that will partly explain the low productivity that we observe in the North relate to both industrial composition and trade, and also the role of foreign direct investment. So when we look at, for example, export orientation, and we know exports is a key measure of competitiveness and is a key driver of productivity, we see that exports account for 15% of total business turnover in the North compared to 54% in the Republic. And the makeup of those exports also differ a lot. So in the North, manufacturing, which tends to be lower value added activity, dominates exports, whereas as in the Republic, exports are dominated by pharmaceuticals and computer services, which are very high value added activity. Another aspect that's been important in terms of the development of the Republic's economy and success over recent decades has been the role of foreign direct investment. And what we see is, again, there are big differences in the employment share of foreign direct investment in both regions, and also the intensity, the productivity of those establishments. So, for example, in the North, foreign direct investment type FDI firms, multinationals, account for 14% of employment compared to 22% in the Republic. And the productivity differences in those firms are very different. So when you look at the average turnover per worker in an FDI or multinational in the North, the turnover is around 200,000 sterling per worker, where it's over $1 million in the Republic. So it's 5 times more productive in terms of the FDI sector in the Republic relative to the North. So again, these differences will be are parts of the story in explaining the differences in the lower productivity in the Northern economy that we see compared to the Republic. So another key question that's going to crop up without a doubt in the border poll debate is the issue of the differences in the health systems North and South. So it's often been said, that people in the North put a lot of value in the NHS, and that will be a major factor in determining the outcomes of any border poll. And it's often assumed that there are large differences in the quality of healthcare, with the North being much superior because it's within this NHS framework. And really, that reality is no longer the case, we don't think. And the data would point towards a significant convergence in the standards of healthcare in both regions over time. When we look at it even just at a spending indicator level, so this data comes from the OECD Healthcare at a Glance report, after accounting for differences in spending, average per capita spending on health in the Republic is €4,000 per annum compared to 3,000 at a UK average level. It is true that the Irish system has more upfront charges, particularly to see a doctor, and a lot of it is made of this fact. However, it's important to note that the Republic's healthcare system does contain important checks and balances for people with existing health conditions or low incomes. And around 45% of individuals do not pay to see a GP because they have these exemptions. And crucially, both health systems are poor performers in an international context. So the OECD tell us that if a health system has an acute care bed occupancy rate of over 90%, that's dangerous because it means the health system can't respond to changes in seasonal demand, such as a flu epidemic, or shocks such as the pandemic that we've all experienced over the last year. And both the UK and Irish healthcare systems do have acute care bed occupancy rates in excess of 90%. And this also points towards failures in social care provision within both countries, because it tells us that there isn't the capacity to effectively move people, particularly elderly patients, from the hospital to the community setting in order to free up ICU beds. And also there's the case that when we talk about the NHS, there isn't a single NHS. There are 4 NHSs. There's one for the North, there's one in Wales, England and Scotland. And the NHS in the North is unfortunately a very poor performer compared to those of the GB regions, particularly when we look at the issue of waiting lists. So pre-pandemic in 2019, 21% of people in the North, which is just under 400,000 individuals, were on a waiting list for elective care. And that compared to 8% of individuals in England, 7% in Scotland and 14% in Wales. And then there's the question of, what is the cost of unification? And we also hear this, the South can't afford us remark going down over the years. And when people talk in that sense, they're usually talking at least subconsciously about the subvention cost. Subvention is the difference in the cost of running the North compared to what is taken in taxes from individuals and businesses. And it's important to note that we don't really know how much subvention is. It's estimated. Bits of it are estimated, bits of it are known. So the last available estimate we have for subvention was from 2018 at 9.2 billion sterling. But it's important to know that not all spending that takes place in the North would be relevant in a border poll that ratifies unification. Not all of that will go across to the Republic of Ireland. So we have these aspects that we call non-identifiables. This is the North share of UK debt servicing costs, defence spending, their share of international services running UK embassies abroad. None of that would be arguably be relevant, or large swathes of it wouldn't be relevant in a border poll ratifying unification. So that would reduce subvention costs by about 25%. We also know that when people here work, they pay national insurance contributions, they build up an entitlement to a state pension, and arguably those liabilities would not come across to the Irish state in the event of a border poll ratifying unification. And that state pension spending in the North amounts to about 3 billion a year. There's also the often ignored aspect that the North also has the share of UK assets, which would form part of any negotiation in terms of any transition to unity. So depending on how negotiations go, this subvention figure would lie somewhere between 4 and 8 billion sterling per year. However, really, we think that talking about subvention, it's a bit of a red herring, really, because it doesn't recognise that subvention only exists because the North's productivity is so low. You've low productivity, there's low income generation, there's low tax receipts, and there's high subvention. And low productivity is not irreversible. And arguably, there's a lot of untapped productivity potential within the North's economy, and it is running well below, I believe, what it should be. And all of that can be changed through proper investments and through a properly designed policy arrangement. So really, the debate around the border poll and the cost of unification is always sort of focused on the subvention issue, which really is not the key issue. The key issue is actually how do we address the structural problems that create the need for subvention, and how do we get around designing a transition arrangement that can put the relevant investments in and deliver higher productivity. That's not to say there won't be a cost of unification, because these investments that we need to affect structural change in key areas such as education, industrial policy and infrastructure are going to be costly. And we have to figure out exactly how much they're going to cost and who's going to pay for it. So in terms of this entire border poll debate, there's lots of questions that really need to be answered. And our research is only really sort of setting those out. And we're a long way off being in a situation where people can go to a poll and actually make an informed decision of what a unified Ireland would actually look like if they vote for it. Because they need answers to questions like, what would an all-Ireland approach to education, health, industrial policy, tax and welfare systems look like? How would the move to these all-Ireland systems impact individuals' everyday lives? And really, these questions can only be answered by systematic, comprehensive reviews of the services in both jurisdictions, thinking about how you would merge them in the most effective way and what the cost of those would actually be. We need to think about this policy framework that we would need to adopt to enhance Northern Ireland productivity, answering questions like, well, what would happen over a 5-year period if we were to increase FDI into the north by 10%? What would the implications be for productivity, for tax revenues, for the subvention that would ultimately roll across? All of that needs to be modelled out and assessed. And really, Adele and I's work has only begun to scratch the surface of the level of information and detail that's needed to really have an informed debate. The amount of planning that needs to be done and research is vast, and we can't afford to wait about, because, as Adele said, we don't know when a border poll will be called or when it will be triggered. We know that it will be done on the basis of some sort of constitutional arrangement involving the Secretary of State of the UK for the North, but we don't know the detail of. There's a lot of uncertainty around it.
Thank you, Seamus and Adele. Fascinating. I'm hoping that you'll be able to answer some questions that occur to me. You've, as you say, Adele, you've in some ways asked as many questions as you've suggested answers, but it's important that those questions are asked at this time when so many people are reconsidering the future of this island and its relationships within the island, across the island, and between this island and Britain and the rest of the world. Adele, you've highlighted a number of factors that might be driving low productivity in Northern Ireland. What do you think is the most important of those?
To be honest, I think they're all important in their own way, but lower levels of education may be the most important factor, because without changing this, it's hard to change other factors like attracting more FDI and so on. And the gap in educational attainment, north and south, really is quite stark. So if you just look at young people today, say take those aged 25 to 30, it's an age group where typically you've finished your full-time education. Over 35% of that age group in the north are qualified to the two lowest levels of educational attainment, so primary or lower secondary, compared to just around 11% in the south. And at the same time, around 40% of young people in the north have post-secondary or third level education, compared to almost 2/3 in the Republic. And the North also performs poorly against GB regions in terms of educational attainment, and has the highest share of young people with the lowest level primary education, and one of the lowest shares of graduates, although I think for third level graduates, they're slightly higher than the North East and Wales. So really, I think human capital development, which strongly determines regional macroeconomic outcomes such as productivity levels, and therefore ultimately growth rates, is probably the most important factor driving the relatively lower productivity in the north.
So you're highlighting differentials in the education systems, north and south. Is that the reason for these differential outcomes? Is it structural? What can you speculate as to why this might be the case and what the implications might be?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the implications of having kind of lower education and enrollment rates are easier to identify than the actual causes of them. So I might start with those. Essentially, for individuals, access to and take up of high quality education provision is really the single most important factor determining career success, wage growth, and social progression. So therefore, we argue it's a key measure of the opportunity for life progression. And I suppose the really important economic point here is that individuals with lower levels of educational attainment tend to earn lower wages. Another point that's relevant is that having access to education and training throughout the life cycle, the concept of lifelong learning, means that individuals can continue to build their skills and their human capital after formal education ends, and this can also ultimately impact productivity. In terms of, you asked why the education enrollment rates are lower across the life cycle in the north. We don't have an answer to that, and it's one of the areas where more research is needed. We don't know whether it's down to the provision of education, so is it on the supply side, or the take-up of places, so demand factors. So I mentioned that the OECD data showed the rate of early school leaving is much higher in the north. So it could be that there are more pathways for young people in the south to access higher levels of education throughout the further education sector. But it is one of the areas where we need more research to understand the why.
But that we need more research in such a fundamental area for our economy, for families, for citizens. That's really an intriguing point you've made there, Adele, and you and Seamus both highlight the need for governments to take these issues, not just in the context of a border poll, but in terms of getting policy within regions, getting it right. Seamus, and thank you, Adele. If I could turn to you, I mean, you've talked about health, and I think many people viewing this would find those results kind of surprising, given what they would have viewed in the media and read about health and the assumption that health outcomes might be better in the north than they are in the south. So it's not conventionally what people seem to believe. Can you say a wee bit more about that? It's also really an intriguing series of points you're making about health policy.
Yeah, I think there have over recent years been substantial changes in the level of service delivery on both sides of the border over recent years. And I think that those changes have brought around about a bit of a convergence, as I said, in health standards. Cross-border differences have been sort of diminishing over time. And I think they're due to two factors. There's been an increase in the level of spending in the Republic on health services, and that's been substantial over the last number of years. And unfortunately, in the north, then we've seen the impacts, I think, of underinvestment arising from a series of austerity budgets, and those factors and different spending paths have resulted in services in the Republic certainly increasing, and services in the north, unfortunately, declining. And as a result, I think it's clear that the NHS can no longer be held up as an international gold standard, particularly in the context of the north in the way that it has been in the past. And as I said, we're beginning to understand that there isn't a single NHS. There are 4 NHSs. And unfortunately, that sort of underinvestment has had very significant impacts over time within the Northern Health Service. So, for example, another statistic that we uncovered was from the Nuffield Trust that pointed out that a person in Northern Ireland is at least 48 times as likely as a person in Wales to wait more than 1 year for care. And that's despite Wales being the least other worst performer in the UK. So it's a quite stark situation. The debate around upfront charges is also one that we hear a lot. And as I said, there is this cost for some people to incur in the Republic to see a GP around €50 and sometimes more, but around 45% of the population don't have to pay that. And it's also important to note that access to GP services is pretty rapid in the Republic. It tends to be on the day that you seek an appointment or the next day. And I've had to use a GP service in the south myself, and access is very fluid. That is not the case in the north, unfortunately. Yes, we do have this universal system of healthcare, but access is becoming very, very difficult. So the latest data that we had from 2017 showed that 27% of patients in the north had to wait more than a week to see a GP. So these barriers to access, as a result of underfunding, has really become a problem. And what we've seen is our private sector GP providers popping up in towns around the north, where people are now are willing to pay an upfront cost to see a GP in order to circumvent the long waiting times that they would otherwise experience. So, but then there is another aspect to this debate, I think, that there's little to be gained in terms of just sort of poking holes in each other's health systems. We need to recognise there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the health systems in both jurisdictions. They're both very weak, as I said, in key areas, particularly around acute bed occupancy, social care, and some other differences exist that cause problems, different types of problems in both either regions. So I think what we need to really have discussions about is how can we have an all-island approach to healthcare that actually takes the best aspects of both systems in order to provide the best service for all the people on this island. Because irrespective of the constitutional position, it just doesn't seem logical to me that we should have two separate healthcare systems. Basic economics tells us this is costly because it involves costly duplication, and we're not able to take advantage of economies of scale. So, I think we can do much better on healthcare for all of our citizens. There are great aspects in terms of both health systems that we need to retain. And really, I think that's the way forward.
That's a really powerful point you've just made. In the context of the recently completed Bangor review in the north and Sláintecare in the south, both administrations struggling with the challenges of how to rationalise infrastructure, increase the standards in hospitals and the service that citizens obtain, and yet they haven't really talked to each other. They haven't collaborated in such a small geography. And Adele, you talked about life expectancy, that actually there's a measurable difference in life expectancy between the two jurisdictions on the island. That's quite stark. What's driving that, do you think?
I think changes in life expectancy really reflect, it's a very complex kind of interplay of social, economic, institutional and health factors. And it's really difficult to untangle the role of each of those in terms of determining differences in life expectancy. But it's some combination of all these factors together that determine life expectancy in a region. So even though we can't definitively say what might be driving the differences, it's a key metric for comparing differences in development across countries and regions. So it's used, for example, by the UN in the construction of their Global Human Development Index. So I think that the key point here is that the idea is that when you're comparing development across countries or regions, you shouldn't just compare economic growth. You should also include something about people and their health. and their capabilities in terms of education. So even though we can't exactly say what's driving the differences in life expectancy, I think it's a good measure of sort of overall differences in general welfare and in living standards across countries.
But I think, would you agree that the fact there is a differential at all in a small island space, most observers would expect there to be different differentials between prosperous areas and less prosperous areas? That's common. But in aggregate, the north and the south, when compared to two jurisdictions, there is a measurable difference in life expectancy. Is striking, and I didn't know that, and it's unexpected, and would, I think, for many people be a shock. Thanks, Adele. Seamus, we've talked about thorny issues, health, education, and you focused on one in your presentation, the question of the subvention. You seem to be downplaying the wrong word, but you question the importance of the subvention in your presentation. It's surprising that one of the key things we hear in this debate is the South can't afford us. And it's not always, by the way, people in the South who say that, but commentators in the North especially like to speculate that would be the case. But you don't think actually that subventions is as big an issue as those commentators suggest?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to note is that when we talk about the subvention, that the amounts that we're talking about are not vast when we look at overall public spending in the Republic. So in the years up to the pandemic, we say the 4 or 5 year period, 2015 to 2019, Irish government spending increased by around 3 billion annually throughout that period. And that's approaching the lower bound of the subvention estimate. So they're not huge amounts when we look at it in that context. But I think that the debate around subvention isn't realistic because it assumes two things. It assumes that subvention is a number that's set in stone. And it also seems to assume that unification will happen a matter of days following a border poll ratifying that option. That's just not realistic. Proper planning means that there has to be a proper planned transition period. And within that, a properly planned transition to unity. So when we look at constitutional upheavals and we look at the Scotland's Future document, which laid out a lot of detail of what an independent Scotland would look like, which arguably should form some sort of benchmark for preparations for a border poll. They talked about a 2-year transition period post-referendum, which I think is way too short. If you look at Brexit, there was a 5-year period following the Brexit referendum, really not a planned transition. It was just one extension after another, a very poor transition period, but nevertheless, it was necessary. And we're still transitioning with aspects of the protocol, as we know. And then when we look at the situation where with the transfer of sovereignty of Hong Kong from the UK to China, I mean, that took 13 years. So I'm not saying that there needs to be a 13-year transition period, but there needs to be a transition period. And within that transition period, we need to sort of ask, how long should it be? And what will we do in terms of policy and investment in order to address the North's low productivity problem? Okay, so and the research and the planning should say this is the optimal transition period, and this is the optimal mix of policies and investments that we need to pursue in order to tackle the North's low productivity and unleash the productivity potential of the region, which, as I said, is operating well below what it should be. So if you do that properly, you plan properly, you invest properly, then what you have as a scenario is rising productivity, rising tax revenues, and lower subvention, and ultimately there could be no need for subvention at the end of that transition. Could be zero or positive in terms of the Irish Exchequer, and this is something that we really need to build in centrally to any sort of unification argument and planning. The North needs to move away from this dependency that it currently has. And I hear some people sort of in the past talk about that dependency as a badge of honour, about how much subsidies they get from Westminster every year. I think that's very depressing. I think this a property plan transition gives an opportunity to escape that dependency, and also to be self-sufficient and to be a net contributor within a unified state. But the question is, who's going to pay for those investments? Now, there is an argument that the EU would pick up some of the bill, and I know they did that in terms of German reunification. That was a slightly different context, but you would expect them to play a role there. The Irish government will clearly have to play a role. Arguably, the departing British administration, you would have at least said they have a moral obligation to play some of a financing role. And then, what is the role of the US? But as part of the planning process, we need to sort of figure out what this optimal transition pathway would look like, optimal policy mix, optimal mix of investment, what's the bill, and who's going to pay for it. And at the end of that subvention, if it's planned correctly, should not be a huge factor.
And you're not preempting any of that. You're asking the questions, and those questions do need to be asked. And Adele, also, you seem to be saying that there is a lot of work still to be done before we can hold a border poll. Why do you think that's the case? Why can't we just have a vote on this now? That there are some people that, for many reasons, are enthusiastic about all of this and want it to happen ASAP. You're cautious. Why?
I think the way to kind of answer this question is to essentially flip it on its head and to say, if there was a border poll today, what would people be voting on? And Seamus touched on some of these issues in earlier, but what would an all-island approach in absolutely key areas like education, health, tax and welfare systems look like? These are really key questions that need to be teased out. We don't know the answers to these things at the moment. And these are the key things that I think voters would need to be informed on, and that voters would want to be informed on before making any decisions. And just to go back to the sort of the timing around the poll, I mean, we can't predict when a border poll could happen. It could happen sooner rather than later. We simply don't know. So it's really important to start making preparations now, to start kind of planning now, because if you fail to prepare for it, you're preparing to fail.
And as you and Seamus have both pointed out, there are very real issues. The low productivity issue is a crucial one to be addressed. And it would seem that the only way to address that is to enable economic agents to achieve economies of scale. And they can't do that confined within the small jurisdiction that is Northern Ireland. And business led the way after the Good Friday Agreement in establishing supply chains on an all-island basis. And that's why the protocol which you referred to, Seamus, is what it is and had to be shaped the way it was. There was no choice. That's the economy led the way and policy making in that case. Seamus, to finish, and it's been fascinating, Adele and Seamus. It really has, and it's prompted me to challenge some of my own thinking, and I'm hopefully viewers similarly. But Seamus, just to finish, in your presentation, you say that part of the evidence would be assessing how the productivity aid issue could be changed following a border poll. But why do we need a border poll to achieve that? Why can't we just get stuck into the productivity issue now without a border poll? Why can't that issue be addressed now? Why does it need a border poll?
That's a good question, Conor, and it doesn't. The investments and the policy changes that are needed to increase productivity could happen under the current constitutional arrangements. I mean, I think that no one doubts the genuine attempts and that the devolved administrations have been making to improve the well-being of people here. But the fundamental issue is, as I said, that these structural changes require substantial investments. And the current funding and governance arrangements in the North just, in my view, do not allow that to happen. So the funding for the North's main devolved departments comes in the form of a block grant, which is determined by this thing called the Barnett formula, which links funding on devolved services such as education, health and transport to reflect spending changes that have taken place in English regions. Now, the needs of English regions are nothing like the needs in the North. Even before the Troubles, the North was at the bottom of the productivity pile. When we look at per capita GDP rankings in 1971, it was at the bottom or close to it. Obviously, we had the Troubles, which again, made the situation worse in terms of the structural problems in the region. And then we've had devolution for a couple of decades now. But basically, under these funding arrangements, what can the administrations and what can devolved ministers do? They have no fiscal autonomy. They have no fiscal levers. Regional policy was a tool of the British government throughout the 70s and 80s to sort of lift poor regions through investments. That's long gone. The British government talk about levelling up, but I spoke to Conor. I listened to Conor Murphy on the television last night, the Minister for Finance. Again, he was emphasising the need for fiscal levers and the lack of fiscal autonomy within the executive. So yes, those things could change, but I just can't see it happening. The only investment that we've heard talked about is some big bridge from Scotland to the north, which is not what we need. We need changes, structural changes and big investment in key service areas. It could happen under the current constitutional framework, but things would have to change radically and fundamentally in terms of the funding structures and the governance arrangements for that to happen. And then you would raise the question, even if the North had these fiscal levers, how much and how far would you get by trying to tax more out of a low productivity economy?
Thank you, Seamus. Thank you, Adele. It's been a privilege to have this opportunity to hear from both of you. Thanks to the Féile for making this possible. In conclusion, the graphic behind me is from the Irish Republic government's Strategy 2040 document. And it now formally acknowledges that the development of the economy of the Republic requires the border between us as a barrier to be dissolved. And what that effectively means is that sovereignty has to be shared between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic in a way that hasn't been possible for most of the last 100 years. The process has to continue. That doesn't mean that some functions will not have to be shared with international partners and with partners in Britain. The Scottish regions, Scotland as a nation, Wales, England, that big island to the east of us cannot be ignored, but nor can the partition boundary prevent the sharing of sovereignties that should have been naturally shared to enable our citizens to reach their full potential, nor can that continue. And however that is to be expedited, surely everyone should have a say in that. We shouldn't have this imposed or any changes imposed on citizens. It should be via a mandate. When that happens, you're right, Seamus and Adele, we need to do the research so that people can be informed and make informed decisions. And this has been, I hope, a contribution to that consideration. So thank you both for taking time from your busy schedules. And thanks again to Féile Belfarista for making this conversation possible. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Conor.
Thanks, Conor.